to get here to DePaul. I'll share some personal aspects of my story, which is also not very common in a scientific presentation, but I think it does help to give you a perspective about all the different backgrounds that your professors come from. And then I'll talk about some of the lessons that I've learned. And one of the main points I think is that for these seminars, it's a series. So we have different presenters that come to give the presentation, and each one of us is, a point. And there might be aspects of a particular presenter's journey that are very relevant to you, and you think, that's great. But there also might be aspects that don't fit your personality. So you take each one and then see what are the lessons I can learn that apply the most to me. Because we're all different. So I don't want to think this is the way we have to go. And so the outline, I'll spend more time on my background probably than I've seen in other presentations. And the reason for that is that I think it's central to understanding why I did all the zigzagging. The zigzagging in terms of my academic journey doesn't quite make sense without information about my family's background and my development. And also, kind of reflecting on this presentation, and you get a sense of how much your background actually influences the way you act and in the decisions you make in terms of your profession. I'll talk about my academic trajectory, and then I'll finish up just talking about the job here at DePaul. So my family's story is one of immigration. On both sides of my family, they were immigrants. And so this is a picture of my grandmother with my father and my uncles. And on my father's side, really they were farm workers. So they lived in southern Ecuador in the Andes Mountains, close to the border of Peru, in a province called Loja. And my father told me the story is basically they were living on the outskirts of Loja, and my grandparents met. And there was a piece of land that wasn't being used, and they put a fence around it. And they started growing plants, and they got some animals, and that's what they were doing. And that was very common back in the day. And so they worked the land, and that's what they did. On my mother's side, it's different. So this is my grandmother, and that's my mom. And when my mom was very young, they had resources. So my mom's side, they were Spanish immigrants, and they were ranchers. They had a big piece of land, and they had cows, they grew milk, so they had more resources. But my grandmother died when my mom was about 10 or 11, and my grandfather apparently didn't take it very well. And so by the time my mom was a teenager, she also didn't have really any resources. So both on my father's side, at some point, probably when my dad was around 15, something like that, they immigrated from the country into the city, into Guayaquil. They went to Guayaquil. My grandparents saw that there wasn't a lot of prospects for progress in the place they had in that area. And on my mom's side, she immigrated by herself. She moved to Guayaquil also independently by herself after her mother died to go to school in Guayaquil, and she was being trained as a pharmacist. So she got a job in that position. In terms of immigration, the numbers are a little bit staggering when you think about them. So these are data from the modern data. But there's an estimated 281 million people that were international migrants in 2020. And that number increased substantially, obviously from 50 years ago. And domestically, the number of domestic migrants is much larger. There's around 763 million. So between those two, about 1 billion people are migrants. There's about 8 billion people, a little bit less than 8 billion people on Earth, so it's a huge percentage of the Earth's population. Many of these domestic migrants are people doing what my parents, my grandparents, and my mom did, moving from a rural area into a city. So my dad was my dad's side of the family, they had to hustle. They didn't really have an education, they didn't have a profession. They got very lucky early on in that my grandmother somehow found someone that knew how to develop film, how to take pictures and develop film. And so my grandmother and my father and my uncles got into that business. Before that, my dad basically had to work selling magazines on the street. A relative had a magazine stand outside the post office. So my dad took the magazines out, walked around the city selling magazines. And then they got into the photography business, and that wound up doing okay for a while. And so that's what they did. And then he met my mom, ironically, even though they were very close together in Loja, they're just a short distance, their towns were. They didn't meet until they were in Guayaquil because they were neighbors across the street. So my mom was working, she was trained in pharmacy, she was preparing the drugs for one of the hospitals, and my dad was doing his photography thing by then. And they were making a living, but again, they were struggling a bit. It wasn't clear what the path to progress was. They were making a living, but they didn't see a great way to improve their lifestyle. So what they decided to do was an act that I think is one of pretty extraordinary courage, which is imagine yourself. Think about the people that are close to you. Think about the aspects of your culture that are important for you. The sports you like to watch, or the music you like to sing, or hear. Think or sing. The food you like to eat. So migrants, what they do is because they don't see a path forward, or because in some cases they feel like they're in danger. In many cases they feel like they're in danger. They decide to make this leap and leave everything they know to try to make a new life. So they immigrated to New York, and I think, when I think of my dad, I think of a lot of our DePaul students, and that my dad really hustled in terms of getting things done, finding a way. There has to be a way, and when I talk to, students in my classes, are often like that. They find a way to get things done. And so my dad had worked in photography, but he had no training, right? Someone taught him how to take pictures, he knew how to develop film, and he had to repair his cameras. And so he interviewed for a job at a Japanese camera repair service. And they asked him, well, so you know how to repair cameras? He said, oh, yeah. So he started repairing cameras, and he lasted about a week. Because he had no idea really how to repair cameras. So he lasted a week there, but in that week he learned enough that he saw a job application at Minolta, which is another Japanese camera service. He interviewed there, he got that job, and then he stayed. He stayed there until Minolta decided to move to New Jersey, and then my parents decided that they didn't want to, move to New Jersey for whatever reason. And so they collected the money they could, and they started a business in Manhattan. And I don't know if you've been in Manhattan. This is something that's becoming rarer, but back in the day, in the 70s and 80s, a lot of shops were owned by individual people. There were, families that just started a shop. And so they had a bazaar on 6th Avenue, which is, if you've been in New York, that's Avenue of the Americas, between 21st and 22nd Street. And it started as a Japanese camera service. So my dad put a sign, Japanese camera service, and he told people he repaired cameras, and they would bring their cameras to him. And they started selling things on the side, and eventually it came to resemble my office. Full of stuff. And so, that's what they were doing. They had this business, they were doing okay. My dad had a good vision for the location, and he was able to make the business be successful. Now, I was the first one in my family born in New York. So I have an older sister, but she was born in Guayaquil, so they brought her as a baby. I was the first one to be born in New York, and I was in the city. I was born in Queens, and we lived in Woodside. And then I moved to Manhattan when I was about 5. And my dad made he made a hole, basically, the shop was on the downstairs. He made a hole in the roof and put a ladder up on the back side and then rented the apartment above. So we had an apartment above the shop. And so I lived in that little apartment above the store. So I was in Manhattan, and I don't know why, but I became very interested in nature and in animals. If you think about it, there's probably something that you feel very lucky for. There's something in your story. If you think about it, there's probably something in your story you feel, I was lucky. For me, it's this component. And I can't really explain it because I was not a lot of wildlife in Manhattan. Not a lot of wildlife. And so this is just a hypothesis, and I don't know how to test it. But one thing I do remember is that my family would go to the Bronx Zoo. And I thought this was a magical place. I remember, the thing I remember was a giant snake that looked like it was, several times my size. And every time I saw it, it was crazy. And when my dad said, hey, it was Sunday, what do you think about going to the Bronx Zoo? I would light up. And so I think it might have been something like that, seeing these animals when I was very young, something. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was a pigeon. Landed on me or something. But for some reason I had this, and then my parents did something really smart, which is they saw I had this interest, and every opportunity they reinforced it. Every opportunity they had, it made me feel like I was a person that knew about animals and nature. And so it got to the point where my parents would take me to a party, and my dad would say, ask Windsor anything about nature animals. He knows everything about nature animals. To basically use me as a party prop. Adults would get together and they would, laugh. And that was my identity. I had that. I really was interested in that. And that became part of who I was. And that's I count that as one of the big blessings, because everything else that happened after that, I always had that. It gave me a direction, which I think would have been a little bit hard without that. If you think about it, you probably have something like that. It might not be this. Many people, most undergraduates I talk with, they don't know what they want to do. It's very common. But there's probably something else. Most of us have something like this. Now, then they had the store in Manhattan, and then the building got sold. And I went back when I was doing my PhD years later to Manhattan. And, the block I remembered, which is all mom and pop owned shops, was now, I'm not exaggerating, McDonald's, Starbucks, across the street, big Barnes and Nobles, all chain stores. Everything had disappeared. But my parents' building got sold, and so my dad decided, I can't restart again. And so, not in the U.S. It was hard then. If you are associated with New York, you probably know in the late 70s, early 80s, New York was rough. You weren't a real New Yorker unless you were mugged. And so we went back to Ecuador when I was 10, and I was happy in New York. I had a couple of uncles and a cousin, and I was happy in school, so I was good. But then when I went to Ecuador, something really clicked in that I found out something different. I had this enormous family in Ecuador that I had not met. And so this is not an old picture, it's a recent picture. These are relatives from one of my mom and, my mom's sister, basically. Our family and my mom's sister's family. So we had this enormous family in Ecuador, and it connected. The food my parents cooked, it was everywhere. The music that was playing in the background, it was everywhere. So things connected, and I went at an age where I was still open to, kind of learning, developing a bond with a culture. My older sister was 4 years older, and she had the opposite experience, actually. She moved back and didn't like it all because she'd become a teenager in the U.S., and she liked the U.S. stuff. But I was younger, so I was more impressionable, and it just connected. I felt like this is, I understand this. And so then my sister didn't like it. So my parents do something that when I've talked to people from the US, I always fear that they're gonna report my parents in hindsight to Child Protective Services. But because what they did was, my sister she just didn't adjust to life in Ecuador, so she went back to New York, and my parents bought a house. They were doing well by then. They bought a house to retire to in Florida. So my sister went to that house to live in Florida because she wanted to be back in the US. And my parents just decided, we don't have any uncles, we don't have relatives there. It's a nice community, but who knows what's gonna happen. She's very young. We want another warm body. So I went to Florida, to a little town called Spring Hill, about an hour north of Tampa, on vacation. And they told me to pack a bag, we're gonna go on vacation, and so I packed my bag and I went to Florida. And then, we were in Florida, and my mom said, hey, why don't we go check out the school? And I said, maybe we need to talk about the concept of a vacation. We're on a break from school. I don't want to go see a school. I'm on vacation. And so little by little on the drive to the school, it turned out that I was going to stay with my sister. And so, that's what they did. To defend my parents, when my dad was much younger than me, he was with my uncles. They would load up the crops on a donkey, and they would walk it to the town where it was sold. And he would have a multiple-day hike where they would stay, at a little house in the forest. And so they were probably thinking, well, you have a house, we're sending you money, you have electricity. Well, what's your problem? You can just stay here with your sister. So I stayed there, and it was a wonderful community. It was a retirement community, very affluent. They bought a house in a nice area. And we had a really nice football stadium with real grass and rugs in every room. So it was really nice. It was a really nice area. The people were helpful, very nice. My parents didn't know anything about education. And so when we went to the school, they had a conversation with administrators about enrolling me. And, they looked at my records. And I remember the administrators over there were just looking at my records and looking at me and trying to figure it out. And they said, we can probably put you in the very basic classes. And so I got, even though I knew algebra really well, I got put in pre-algebra. And then, this is sad, but it happened. They put me in Spanish. I knew Spanish. I was Ecuadorian. And so that was the one thing I protested about. I probably don't need to take Spanish class. I know Spanish. But the lady said, but do you know the grammar well? Because we're going to teach you the grammar. And I said, well, actually, I don't know the grammar well. And, people can attest, I actually don't know the grammar rules well. I know how to speak Spanish. But so they put me in Spanish class, and they weren't trying to be mean, but they didn't quite get it. So halfway through the conversation, I realized that my report card was on a grading scale of 20 from Ecuador. They were used to a scale of 100. They thought I was failing every class. And they put me in all these remedial classes. And so I was not very happy because I'd been exposed to this huge family, to this different culture, and I lost it without having a say in it. And then I was in classes where I just didn't, I was also a year younger than everyone. My mom moved me up. There were a bunch of things. I just wasn't happy. So my first decision as an adult, which I wasn't really an adult, I was a couple of months over 17, but once I graduated from high school, was I want to go back to Ecuador. I want to go back to my family. And I did not do any research on the university. So this is one place where you probably don't want to take this piece of advice. Just go to university where you want to be in. But it turned out great for me. So it worked out. It was just a lucky happenstance. But I went back to Guayaquil, and I wanted to study biology. I knew that. I wanted to study biology. And so the university that taught biology back then was the Universidad de Guayaquil. Only biology school in Guayaquil at that time. Now there's several others. And so I enrolled, and it was a large public university. It was a 5-year program, biology, very different structure. Again, something, that a lot of people get surprised about. In the US, we have this major system, which provides you with a very broad education in many different areas. In Ecuador at that time, it was very different. People going to college needed to graduate and work. They needed to be the one, I needed to be a professional biologist after 5 years. So the school was a biology school, like you would go to veterinary school or medical school. It was a biology school. There was some English, some physics the first year, calculus first year, and chemistry throughout, and then it was all biology, 5 years of biology classes. So I found myself, I was miserable in high school, I'd gotten lost. If you've moved around as a kid, in hindsight, I think I learned a lot of that experience, but when you go through it as a kid, when you have big moves, and you lose your friends, it's often not that fun of experience. So in the University of Aguirre, I found myself. I really found, this is who I am, I'm a biologist. I was in a school where we were learning biology, and there were all these professors that were professional biologists, and my friends were all studying biology, and I was okay with that. So I liked the classes. I remember I took a class called Morfología Animal, which is animal morphology. And the class introduced us to the basic structure of animals and their taxonomic classification. And I kind of remember taking that class and learning about all the different phyla and their characteristics and just having a vision, like I understand. I understand how animals are grouped. So I don't want to minimize the classwork. I did like the classes. But we did other things. So I got together with friends, we formed an ecological club, and we did things around the university. We painted murals, we planted plants, we did some public education. But the big thing about this experience was really the outside research experiences. So at that time, things have changed. And maybe, when I talk to Ecuadorian biologists, everyone complains about resources. We still need more resources, but there are many more resources than back then. At that time, there just weren't a lot of resources for original research. So it was often college students that were doing the research that wound up telling us about how things worked. And so I was able to do things like volunteer at the museum. And so a biologist, Felix Mangin, let me volunteer at the museum and put me in charge of the mammal section first and then the fishes. But, so I worked with both groups. And I was the person in charge of these. The other thing that happened, and I brought some props. So my dad was a photographer, so he had cameras that he'd repaired. And so when I was in college, I told him, it'd be nice to take pictures. And he gave me a camera that he repaired, which is a Nikkor mat. And I have it. So this is the old camera. And so most of my friends didn't have a camera. And it's not a fancy camera. And the photometer never worked. So your cameras have a light meter that tells you how much light is coming in, so you can adjust the speed or the shutter, the f-stop. And it never worked, but I had this camera that basically other people didn't have. Like I had a camera with a lens that had some power, and so most of my friends knew I had this camera, so they would ask me to go with them on research trips. So I wound up going on a lot of research trips, taking pictures for people. And that became kind of a big thing, and I've carried that, so I still have that camera, and I still love taking pictures. And this is for some people that have been to Isla de la Plata, which there's a few people besides me that have been there. This is Isla de la Plata. These are goats. That's an invasive species, introduced species. They were all exterminated some years after that. But this is a picture of introduced goats on Isla de la Plata, the little Galapagos on the coast of Ecuador. The major research experience I had was I volunteered for a foundation called the Ecuadorian Foundation for the Study of Marine Mammals. And again, there wasn't real, in the United States, when a marine mammal gets stranded, there's a professional team that will go out and work with that animal to try to save it. Or if it's dead, to collect the material and do an autopsy, figure out what happened to it, maybe collect the materials for scientific research. We didn't have that. So it was the students that would organize in groups, and we would go on expeditions basically along the beach looking for any marine mammal that had stranded, and died, to collect the materials and try to figure out why it died, and collect the materials for museums. I also worked on a dolphin identification project. So most of you probably know this, but you can, dolphins have little nicks and cuts on their dorsal fins. So you can take pictures of those and then identify specimens. Then you go out the next time on the same trip, take a picture of the dorsal fins, see how many specimens or new captures that you had photographed and how many are old. And the proportion, a little bit of math gives you an estimate of the population size. So we did that and worked with humpback whales too. So I was pretty involved with that. And where's the IRB people? The institutional people. So this was way back in the day. And so, people studying with viruses might want to take samples from me because this is the type of thing we would do before, we had real regulations. We didn't know what we were doing. So when an animal stranded, we had these gloves, and then basically we would cut the materials to take bones out of it. And then many of these skeletons are actually still available in Ecuador. Some of them are displayed. So the material was put to good use, but you can see my friend Fabricio is standing on the head of a sperm whale, and we would wind up with all the insides of these rotten cetaceans all over our bodies. So I don't know what type of viruses might have infiltrated themselves in my genome, but yeah, so we survived. We didn't lose anyone. And so one piece of advice I would say is, if you can, try to, it's not that the classes aren't great. I teach lecture classes. I'm not encouraging you, Dr. Aguirre said you should skip your class. Don't skip a class. Go to classes, but many of the most powerful experiences you will have as students are experiences you have outside of the classroom. So seek those opportunities. It can be a little bit scary. What if they don't want me? What if they reject me? What if I mess it up? It can be a little bit scary. But at the end of the day, you have to find ways to find opportunities to interact with the world outside of the classroom, to get experience in your field. Those experiences are often the more powerful ones. In terms of telling you whether you really like something, I like being a biologist. I loved all these experiences. Often it's telling you don't like that. And that's just as valuable. Making sure you know that this isn't for you. Which often things that you think aren't for you when you do actually work on it. So, and just as a side note, our College of Science and Health here at DePaul and the biology department, they're investing heavily now, and you'll see them if you're a freshman or sophomore if you're here in the near future. The people in our college and our department are investing a lot of time and creating more courses that provide these research experiences for you. And so that's something that also, hopefully in the near future, we already have, but hopefully we'll have more of. And I think these are, powerful experiences. Now, the context matters. So when I was in Ecuador, the economic conditions were not good. This was in the 90s, in college, I'm talking about, in the 90s. And honestly, the economic conditions had never been great. And that's true for many parts of the world. It seems like you're in crisis mode, then you're in crisis recovery, and then you go to new crisis. Different crisis, banking, housing. So it seems a little bit like the nature of the world. But Ecuador wasn't doing well, and there were lots of people moving around. And the University of Guayaquil was basically free at that time. It was a public institution, so tuition was very low cost, but they had no real resources. And so one of the things I took from this, in hindsight, was the power that individuals can have. Like when I think back about the things that some of my professors and some of the staff went through, which is the lack of resources, it's really hard. Not everywhere, in the world has all the resources that we're lucky enough to have in the U.S. in many cases. So there were pretty high poverty rates, and the minimum wage in Ecuador is still $425. So many people make $425 a month, or there's many people, especially outside of cities, that are underemployed. So they make less than that. And some of the most vulnerable people are children. So children are born in these environments, and they don't have a say. And they didn't make a choice. They didn't choose, they didn't make a bad choice. They're born in environments where they often lack something or many things. And so one of the things that happened when I was in the University of Aguirre was that there were European scientists that came to work with Ecuador's major agriculture research laboratory called SENAIM. And Eric Mian is a French scientist that worked on molecular population genetics. And there were other scientists that came. And Eric and other scientists and Eric's family had owned an orphanage in France. So he knew a little bit about working with kids. And they saw lots of poverty and lots of kids that seemed to need help. So they organized among the scientists, and then they recruited us. They recruited college students they interacted with. I met Eric when we found a sea lion. They found a sea lion, and they called our foundation, the Ecuadorian Foundation for the Study of Marine Mammals, to see what to do about it. And they sent us to talk to Eric. And I was in college, and the three of us that went were in college, and we didn't know what we were talking about. But I tell you that story because Eric met us then and was very kind. So he was really sharp. He could pick up, we had some suggestions, but they're very general. But he picked up on that, but he also picked up that we were very interested in nature, very interested in biology, and we were very engaged and tried to make the world a better place. So instead of Eric telling us, well, you don't know what you're talking about, he was very patient. And then sometime later, he invited us to work with this organization that they were developing called Niños y Medio Ambiente, which means children and the environment. So they developed this organization that worked with kids, including some populations that were in bad shape. So there were kids from an orphanage that didn't have a lot of resources, but there were also working kids. So at that time, that's not the case anymore. It's not legal for children to work in Ecuador anymore, but in the 90s it was. A lot of children worked cleaning shoes or selling candy. We also worked with a population of kids that lived in prison with their mothers. And that was kind of a weird situation because the kids could leave the prison anytime. They weren't inmates, but the mothers couldn't leave. So the kids would leave the prison and go in. And so Eric hooked up with people that were working with these populations of children. And this program, the idea was to provide kids with the opportunity to have positive role models and interact with nature. If you're interested in natural sciences, you've probably seen the effects that animals can have on kids. And so I remember these kids that worked on the street. This is an image from the internet. This isn't one of our kids. But the kids that worked on the street, they were tough. They were tough. They weren't buying usually what we had to tell them about, science and education. They were tough. But when we brought the animals in, I remember we had this boa constrictor that someone had caught in the forest. There's a boa constrictor, someone caught it. We kept it in captivity, and it had a trick to it. Many snakes do this, but the kids didn't know. So when you first opened the cage and got it, the snake was incredibly aggressive. It hissed and rolled around, and it looked like it was fighting and all this. And then usually within a minute, it became like a puppy. It just calmed down, completely calm, no issues. And so we knew that trick, so we would always start it up with, hey kids, if this is a special occasion, maybe the snake will cooperate. We can get out and you can touch it. And so we would do this, and you would see these kids that had this, just this impenetrable persona. They would break down. They would start asking questions. They would say, "Can I touch it over here? What does it eat? Why does it smell that way?" They would start to engage. Animals are a very powerful connector, often with children, and so So we had that. We had Eric and his group developed a farm in Guayaquil, so they rented a large space where we had farm animals, and we had things like the snake, we had scorpions, things that biology students could get. He rented a house on the beach close to St. Naim where we would take the kids, and we would often take them to see dolphins. So this is a group of kids, see bottlenose dolphins. We would take them to caves, to do bat activities. And all the time, we were trying to interact with them. Just, this is, you have a right to enjoy your life. Now, these experiences were very powerful. Like, for me, I really love my life. Like, I have a good life. I'm grateful my background, taught me about my life. But those years I had as an undergraduate when I felt like I was always engaged in doing things that were helping people and making a meaningful difference, those were the years where I really felt alive. I felt every day mattered. We had to do something, and if we didn't do it, no one else was going to do it. Many of the kids did well. So one of my good friends from college actually became the director of NEMA, and one of the kids that we worked with became an assistant, and went to college. So many of the kids did well, but this kid, he was one of the kids we worked with early on, and he got HIV, and he died a few years later. And I wasn't that close to him. I met him a few times. My friend became much more closer. But it's the idea of multiply this type of situation by hundreds of millions of kids, where you get kids that wind up in these situations through no fault of their own. So, I put this slide in because I'm telling you to try to experience life and do things that are meaningful, but it can be hard because things don't always turn out well. If you engage in things that are meaningful and important, they often don't work. Right? They often don't work. So, I would say, if you want to feel alive, you have to live your life. But you also have to make sure that you're realistic about what your limits are. So there is a point where you need to maybe take a break. Maybe that's a step too far. Maybe that's too dangerous. And I like this cartoon about, putting your mask on in an airplane first. And the point of this cartoon is not to make you grab a mask before anyone else gets it, make you feel selfish. But the point is, you're not going to help anyone if you're unconscious. You have to be in a position where you can help people. And so you have to take care of yourself first and put yourself in a position where you have the ability to do things that are meaningful. If you're not doing that, you might actually become, you can get in a difficult situation. So experience life, do these things, but also be realistic about there are laws of physics and biology, and there are bad things that happen. So from there, I wound up going I was a farm intern for I worked with the NEMA, and then my plan was, okay, I finished undergraduate. I don't know enough. I'm going to go to the U.S. and get a master's. And so I graduated from college around May, and I thought, when I was working at NEMA, Eric had arranged with the director of this program in New York called Green Chimneys to have someone from our organization in Ecuador go and act as an intern in this organization for their summer. And so I was graduating from college. I knew English perfectly well. I had an American passport. So I was a natural person to send. So they sent me to do this internship as a form of exchange. So I worked with Green Chimneys. Now, my plan was I'm going to get a master's, so I get there in May, and I'm going to apply for a graduate school, and I'll be ready in plenty of time for August, to start in August. And of course, that's not how graduate school works. So I had to take a year off, but I did work there for a couple of months. And Green Chimneys was a great institution. They had many of the things, the NEMA program had many elements that were actually taken from the Green Chimneys model, because someone from the US had come to work with us in Ecuador, and that person had worked in Green Chimneys. And so they had a farm, and they had a wildlife rehabilitation center. They had plants they were growing. They had this really cool program called Farm on the Move, where they would pack farm animals, small farm animals, and take them to the inner city of New York. We'd go to Brooklyn, Bronx. I think those are the major places we went. And then public city kids would come out and see the farm animals. And if you need a calling, you should see city kids interact with like a chicken, and you tell them, that's a chicken. And they're like, that's a chicken? That's a chicken. So many of the kids in these neighborhoods really had no interaction with animals, so we did things like that. And I'd worked with NEMA for about a year, maybe between a year and 2 years. And we'd worked on building all these things. And I went to Green Chimneys and I saw all the things they had. But the other students that were interns, where I was very excited, I saw all the things they had and the great things they were doing with the kids. The students were often very critical. And I realized one of the main reasons is that just things aren't equal. The resources that exist are not equally distributed, on the planet. And so within the United States, there's great inequality. And that inequality is getting stronger, so the middle class is generally getting weaker. But if you go outside the United States, that's even worse. So programs like Green Chimneys that I thought, this is fantastic because I've been trying to build things like it. They were so hard. I could see that those were things that, were pretty standard. And so it's a problem, and this is something I still struggle with because I'm not an environmental scientist, I'm an evolutionary biologist. But as far as I know, as far as I understand, it's not possible to bring all 8 million people on Earth up to the standard living of the average American. So if I became president of the world tomorrow and declared everyone shall have a standard living of the average American, as far as I understand, there's not enough natural resources that our Earth could produce or recycle for everyone to live at what would be considered a pretty average standard in the United States. Okay. So I eventually got accepted to some master's programs, and then in the U.S., many students don't know this. This is why I mentioned this, including at DePaul. Master's programs are often funded. Not always, many of them aren't. But often they're funded, which means students are admitted in biology will get tuition waivers and a modest stipend in exchange for work as a research assistant or a teaching assistant. But many are funded. And master's programs are fantastic. If you're not clear on your direction and you feel like you need a little bit more experience, a master's program can be excellent for that. It can also teach you techniques or tools that you might think are important for the next step. In some situations, like in mine, they're really important for building students up. So I had a great experience as an undergraduate, but my undergraduate program was very different from a typical undergraduate program in the United States. And I hadn't learned many of the things that were taken for granted in graduate programs in the US. So I really, when I came, wasn't prepared to go directly to, kind of a leading PhD program. So I applied to a master's, and then the other thing that happened is sometimes you make the right choice for completely wrong reason. So when I was applying to master's programs initially, I was looking to become a specialist on systematics of forest mammals. I'd worked with mammals, marine mammals and forest mammals. I really like forest mammals in South America. The possum family is very diverse. I thought I was going to work with those. And so I decided to change because my plan was I'll get my master's and go back to Ecuador. And if I'm going to go back to Ecuador, where am I going to get a job as a mammal systematist? There are a few positions, but I could probably be a fish biologist, get a job as a fish biologist, and do my research on evolution on the side, basically, when I had some extra time. So I switched to fishes for that reason, which I didn't go back to Ecuador, obviously. So I think it was the right choice for me in terms of evolution, what I became interested in. but it wasn't for the reason that I changed. So you never know. The point is, some things that you're interested in now, your interest might switch as you gain experience. And often that's good. That's a good switch. So my master's was at the Gulf Coast Research Laboratory, and I was working with fish otoliths. And my thesis was about trying to understand the factors that influence the morphology of these structures that fish have in their ears. And I was working with otoliths and cyanids. Cyanids have enormous otoliths for some reason. They're sonic fishes. They have these enormous ear mineral deposits in their ears, and they vary often in species-specific ways in morphology from species to species. So I was working on that. The punchline is I didn't figure it out, but I did do other things for the project, so I did wind up getting some things out. But you know, I got the master's there, and then one thing that was really important is summer. So I brought, you know, props. So I took a summer course in applications in biotechnology. It was a 5-week course for graduate students at the Gulf Coast Research Lab. And I'd taken a molecular biology class the semester previous in the master's program, but it was really like a traditional class where you learned one method, and next week you did another method, next week you did another method. So I kind of knew how to do the methods, but not really. I understood them, but not that deeply. This workshop was basically an intensive workshop all about applications of biotechnology geared towards applied research in fisheries, things like sequencing DNA, things like that. And so it was a transformational experience because before that, my thesis was going to be morphology based. After the workshop, I was able to switch it to a molecular based, I add a molecular based component to it, which is now something my lab uses a lot. And so summers can be incredibly important as research, to get internship opportunities, research opportunities, or to learn special skills. There are often summer institutes or workshops that can teach you things. Okay, from there I went to the PhD program. I applied to PhD programs. A PhD program is something in which you expand the boundaries of human knowledge in a very specific direction. Like a little, you know, you kind of start broad as an undergraduate, master's, and then PhD. It's like a tiny area where you just push human knowledge a little bit, expand it just a little bit, but you expand it. It teaches something new about the nature of about nature and our planet. My advice to students, if you talk to me about PhD programs, is that you only get one choice. So I would suggest you try to go for the best program you can go in. It is the terminal degree, so there is no other PhD program unless you're going to switch field or add something, and that's very, very rare. So I was admitted my second year. I wasn't admitted my first year that I applied for PhD programs. And I wound up going to the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and it was just a wonderful PhD program. It was about 50 students that were all PhD students in ecology and evolution, with the faculty basically being either the people that wrote the textbooks on particular fields, or in some cases developed the fields. And these were all people in the PhD program. And I don't even have Jim Rolfe, who's one of the people that was an early leader in geometric morphometrics, which is the other major tool my lab used. So we had this program that had all these specialists. And when I got there, I got an email from Nina Mong, who had just started. She started the same year as I did. And she sent me a personal email to, congratulate me about getting into the PhD program and saying, hey, I understand you're in ecology and evolution. I really like that. So it was personalized. Like she was talking to me. And she invited me to learn about their programs. And so they had a bunch of activities that were intended to support students from underrepresented groups in science. And so I joined AGEP, and then a few years later, I got a Turner Fellowship, and both of those gave me resources and additional training for my PhD. Now, first year graduate programs, and our master students can tell you this, I think, the first year graduate programs are often the toughest. So the first year in the PhD program for me was rough. I don't think I was ever in the imminent danger of dropping out. But there were weeks where I just was, that sucked. That was bad. And in those rough times, that was that first year. After that, I kind of got better. But the main thing that I found that was helpful for me, and I think often people that struggle in PhD programs or have difficulties, one of the things they point to is someone invested time in them. Like someone talked to them. So this is one thing I worry about, and this is more to the faculty, is that often one of the most valuable resources that it seems students need is time. And that tends to be one of the things that we have the least of. But Mike Bell was my PhD advisor, and he was pretty extraordinary because he was very busy, very active, very successful, was one of the editors for the book on the evolutionary biology of the three-spine stickleback that I worked with. And I don't know how he found the time, but we would meet Friday afternoons, and we had a 1-hour meeting, which usually wasn't about my PhD project. It was about random things. And we just had these conversations, often telling me about, some people maybe he knew in the past, or the conference, something. Just these things that were conversational and not grilling me about, how's the project going? How's the project going? How's the project going? And I found that, so when I had these hard weeks, after that conversation, I usually just feel like this burden was taken off me, and I felt, okay, I got this. My colleagues, that's, I think, something that's important. Try to find time. So I'll skip over these. For my dissertation, I worked with the evolution of the three-spine stickleback, and so I studied how basically this form evolves from this form. I did that in a time series where we had a lake that had been colonized by anadromous fish and evolved into these freshwater. So I looked at their morphology. And I also wound up looking at the interaction between gene flow and natural selection. So how does that influence local adaptation? So I worked with those things. I stayed on at Stony Brook for a couple of years as a Turner faculty trainee. And then after that, as part of this, I had to develop an independent research program. And so what I wound up doing is I needed a new direction. And during my PhD, I'd seen the power of geographic structuring to allow adaptation and evolution. And so even though I'd never worked with freshwater fishes in South America before, I decided that's what I should do. And I looked at the education I received at the University of Guayaquil to know that very few people had worked with freshwater fishes in the western region, where Guayaquil is. Because there's relatively low fish diversity, it's a small area, there's very high endemism. And I knew there was very little research about it, and I also knew that so it's this area here in western Ecuador, these are the Andes, this is a rainforest, this continues all the way to Brazil, so this is incredibly diverse. Much lower diversity, but very, very high endemism, things that only occur there. I knew it was an interesting area because there was a lot of endemism, and I also knew that this is one of the areas that was suffering the worst consequences of environmental degradation. There's problems with mining, dams, overfishing, everything that affects aquatic ecosystems was happening at large scales in western Ecuador. So I knew these endemic species were also under very severe threat. And if you're looking for a cause, this is not something that's only occurring there. So globally, we think that about a third of freshwater fish species are threatened with extinction. And and that goes across different biomes. So about 2 billion hectares of forest, or 1/3 of the forest cover that we had 10,000 years ago, has been lost. So the environmental problem that we're seeing occurs at a global scale. If you're looking for something to do, be a champion for the planet. Okay, and then I went to DePaul, so I landed there as assistant professor, and I expanded my research, and I started another model system with Oceanics. And then, since then, I've continued to work with the freshwater fishes of western Ecuador. So in 2015, we published the first field guide. Before then, it was very difficult to identify most species. So with a bunch of colleagues from Ecuador, we published the first field guide. And last year, we published a pretty big review article on all the conservation threats for the freshwater fishes of Ecuador in general. kind of using elements of my past to guide the research program that started initially at the postdoc training, but then at DePaul. And also we've organized study abroad courses in Ecuador. So we have a Galapagos Evolution Society course that is running next summer. And we have Biodiversity of the Modern Extinction Crisis, a first-year program course that's running next summer. Both of these are also elements that draw from my experiences in the past in Ecuador. It's not that you can't develop a study abroad if you haven't been in the country, but I do think it's a better experience if you have been there. So the last thing I wanted to finish with is, when I was a kid, I often worried about, and then when I was starting the graduate program in the US, I worried about, I had this weird trajectory, like it's different. One of the things I learned is, those differences that we sometimes are worried about, those are the things that are the unique components of what we bring. My weird trajectory going back and forth gave me a different perspective of the needs for research, both in Latin America and translational in the US, than most of my colleagues could have in either country. So I kind of have used these weaknesses, these differences, as this isn't my place. This is what I can bring. So you probably have elements to your story that are different, that are distinct. One of the tricks about trying to be successful is try to find the things that you have, that you can bring, that other people can't bring. That's where your greatest contribution is. So do you have a tie with a particular community for which there's a need? That's somewhere where you can make a real contribution, where you have these elements that are unique to your story. That's somewhere where you can, that it becomes difficult for other people, so you can branch out in new perspectives, in new directions. As opposed to walking, I often try to be careful about, do I want to do something that really any group of 20 other people that are right next to me could do? Do I want to find something where I can make a real difference, where I can contribute something that's needed? So anyway, that's my piece of advice. And then also give back where you can. And this is something that's important. So my dad had a really good life. But I think, when we, even if it doesn't feel like, if you're in this room, you probably got a significant level of things that you should be grateful for relative to many other people. And so I do feel a little bit of an obligation in terms of people that didn't have the opportunities and access to resources that I had. And so I think if you can, where you can, try to think about the people that are less fortunate than you and be an advocate for them. Do things that might be helpful to expand resources for other people. I think you'll find that's about helping other people, and when you help other people, the person you often find helping the most is yourself. It can bring a lot of meaning and significance to your life. Okay, sorry I went way over. So thank you very much. Time for questions.
If you have time.
Yeah, maybe. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. Quiz. Well, thank you for coming.